The courtroom erupted in laughter as the judge sneered at the young black teenager standing before him. "You think you belong here?" But moments later, the laughter died. The boy wasn't just any defendant. He was the lawyer who had just turned the case upside down. The air inside the courtroom was thick with authority. Rows of polished mahogany benches gleamed under the fluorescent lighting, and the towering judge's bench cast a shadow over the defendant's table. The room was filled with seasoned lawyers, stern-faced prosecutors, and a jury that had already decided what they thought of the case before it had even begun. And then he walked in. Elijah Carter, dressed in a faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers, stood at the center of the room like an intruder in a space that did not belong to him. He was barely 19, his frame still carrying the remnants of adolescence, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, held a depth that did not match his appearance. Judge Reynolds, a man known for his rigid, no-nonsense demeanor, barely looked up from his papers before sighing in exasperation. He removed his glasses, squinted at the young black teenager before him, and smirked. "Are we really doing this?" he muttered, shaking his head. "Where is your lawyer, kid?" A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the room. The court clerks exchanged knowing glances, the prosecutor smirked, and even a few jury members chuckled. To them, this wasn't a case, it was a joke, but Elijah didn't flinch. "I am my lawyer," he said, his voice steady. The laughter grew louder. The judge's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" Elijah cleared his throat, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a neatly folded document. According to state law, any individual who has passed the bar examination and been formally admitted to the State Bar Association is legally permitted to practice law, regardless of age. He unfolded the paper and slid it across the defendant's table. "Which I have." Silence. A court assistant hesitantly picked up the document and handed it to Judge Reynolds. The judge's smirk faded as he scanned the paper. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, but he quickly masked his reaction with a scoff. "This is ridiculous," he said, tossing the paper back onto the table. "You expect me to believe that some street kid barely old enough to vote is an actual lawyer?" A bailiff near the back of the room frowned slightly. Something about this kid didn't add up. His posture, the confidence in his voice. This was not someone who stumbled into court by accident. But before he could say anything, the prosecutor leaned forward with a smirk. "Your Honor," he said, glancing at Elijah with amusement. "This must be some sort of misunderstanding. Surely a boy like him doesn't actually expect to argue a case in this court." More murmurs. A few heads nodded in agreement. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply. He had seen plenty of self-proclaimed geniuses walk into his courtroom. But this was outright absurd. He leaned forward, laced his fingers together, and fixed Elijah with a patronizing stare. "I'll tell you what, kid," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "If you're truly a lawyer, then go ahead. Represent yourself. But don't expect me to go easy on you." A hush fell over the room. Everyone waited for the boy to falter, to hesitate, to back down. But Elijah merely smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the bailiff tense, the prosecutor shift uncomfortably, and, for the briefest of moments, the judge's confident facade flicker with uncertainty. Because what no one in that courtroom realized yet was that Elijah Carter was not just a lawyer. He was about to become the smartest person in the room. The air in the courtroom remained tense, thick with amusement and disbelief. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips as he studied Elijah like a child who had wandered into the wrong playground. "So, you're really going through with this?" the judge mused, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're going to stand there and pretend that you belong in my courtroom as a lawyer?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his worn-out backpack, pulled out a leather-bound legal pad, and calmly flipped it open. The deliberate nature of his movements made the murmurs in the room grow quieter. He was not scrambling. He was prepared. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Charles Whitmore, chuckled and adjusted his tie before standing. "Your Honor," he said, turning to the judge, "I'm willing to humor the boy. I say we allow him to proceed. That way, when he inevitably embarrasses himself, we can put this nonsense to rest and move on with the actual case." Laughter rippled through the courtroom again, but this time it was uneasy. Judge Reynolds exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples as if debating whether this was worth his time. Then, with a sigh, he gestured toward the bench. "Fine," he said. "Proceed, Mr. Carter. Let's see what kind of lawyer you really are." Elijah finally looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with an unreadable expression. Then he turned toward Whitmore, the prosecutor who had just made the mistake of underestimating him. "Thank you, Your Honor," Elijah said smoothly. He turned a page in his notebook, as if he had been expecting this exact opportunity. "Since I'm now officially representing myself, I'd like to begin with a motion to dismiss." Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Elijah lifted his chin slightly. "On the grounds that the prosecution has failed to provide any substantial evidence to justify the charges against my client, who, in case anyone has forgotten, is me." A ripple of silence spread across the courtroom. Judge Reynolds exchanged a glance with Whitmore, who let out a sharp laugh. "Are you serious?" the prosecutor scoffed. "That's your strategy? A flimsy motion to dismiss?" Elijah tilted his head. "It's only flimsy if you don't understand the law, Mr. Whitmore." A murmur of intrigue moved through the crowd. The smirk on Whitmore's face twitched slightly, but he quickly masked his irritation. "Very well," the prosecutor said, rolling up his sleeves as if preparing for an easy battle. "Then let's entertain this farce for a moment. Why don't you explain to the court exactly why the charges against you are unjustified?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "Certainly," he said, his voice steady. "According to case law precedent, Briggs v. Montgomery, a case must be dismissed if the prosecution fails to establish clear probable cause in its initial filing. As of now, the prosecution has relied solely on circumstantial evidence, none of which directly implicates me in any wrongdoing." Judge Reynolds frowned slightly. Whitmore's jaw tensed, but Elijah wasn't finished. "In addition," he continued, "I'd like to point out that the arresting officer's written statement contradicts the video evidence provided. In his report, Officer Grayson stated that I was uncooperative and aggressive during detainment. However," Elijah paused for effect, then reached into his bag and pulled out a USB drive. "The surveillance footage from the scene tells a different story." For the first time since the trial had begun, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his smirk vanishing. Whitmore's confidence wavered. "Where did you get that?" the prosecutor asked, his voice quieter now. Elijah shrugged. "It's called doing my homework." Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead as he glanced toward the bailiff. "Play the footage," he ordered. The courtroom fell into hushed anticipation as the video began. On the screen, security footage showed the exact moment of Elijah's arrest. The grainy video captured the entire exchange. Elijah standing still, hands raised, completely compliant. Yet the officer shoved him against the car, accused him of resisting, and wrote a false report that would have been enough to convict him if Elijah hadn't found the footage first. The silence in the room was deafening. Elijah turned back to Whitmore, his expression unreadable. "Now, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but razor-sharp, "would you like to explain to the court why this evidence wasn't submitted by your office?" The prosecutor's face turned red. His lips parted, but no words came out. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes, tapping a finger against his desk. The playful smirk he had worn at the start of the trial was long gone. "Well?" the judge pressed, glancing at Whitmore. "I'd like to hear an explanation." The prosecutor stammered, scrambling for an excuse, but it was too late. Elijah had just done the impossible. He had put the prosecution on defense. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The tension was suffocating, thick like a storm waiting to break. Judge Reynolds, for the first time that morning, looked genuinely unsettled. His fingers tapped impatiently against the bench as he shifted his gaze toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said, his voice colder now, "would you like to explain why this court was not made aware of this evidence?" Whitmore's face was flushed. He fumbled with his papers, but the damage had already been done. He had walked into the courtroom fully confident, laughing at the idea of taking a teenager seriously. But now, he wasn't just on the defensive. He was exposed. Elijah stood tall, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him. His presence no longer felt like that of a lost boy trying to find his way in a courtroom full of professionals. Number He had just seized control. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he started, forcing a smirk, "this evidence is hardly conclusive. The footage is grainy at best, and—" Elijah raised a hand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," he interrupted, his voice smooth but commanding. "But are you suggesting that a sworn officer's written testimony, which is demonstrably false, should carry more weight than video footage from a security camera?" Whitmore's mouth snapped shut. Elijah let the silence stretch. Then he took a step forward, turning slightly so that the jury could see him more clearly. "Let's be honest," he continued, his voice unwavering. "If I walked into this courtroom dressed like you, with a designer suit and an expensive watch, you wouldn't be questioning my credibility." He glanced toward Judge Reynolds, his gaze unwavering. "But because I walked in wearing sneakers and a hoodie, I was written off before I even spoke." A ripple of discomfort moved through the jury box. Judge Reynolds stiffened. "Watch yourself, Mr. Carter." Elijah met his gaze without blinking. "I intend to." The judge's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The power dynamic was shifting, and he knew it. Elijah turned back to Whitmore. "You had an obligation to turn this footage over to the defense. Instead, you buried it, because it contradicted the narrative you wanted to sell." He leaned in slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, was that your decision, or were you just following orders?" Whitmore's hands clenched into fists. "I don't have to sit here and be insulted by a child," he snapped. Elijah smiled. "You're right," he said. "You don't. But you do have to answer for misconduct." The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply. "Enough," he said, though his voice lacked the authority it had before. He turned toward Whitmore. "I'll be reviewing this matter separately." His tone suggested it would not be a favorable review. Whitmore sat down, defeated, his confidence shattered. But Elijah wasn't done. He turned toward the officer who had arrested him, Officer Grayson, a burly man with a hardened expression. "Officer Grayson," Elijah said, "I have a few questions for you." The officer crossed his arms. "I'm not answering anything without my union lawyer present." Elijah nodded. "Fair enough. But just to be clear, you filed a sworn statement claiming I was hostile and physically uncooperative, correct?" Grayson didn't respond. Elijah smiled. That's interesting, he mused, because according to my medical report, I had no bruises, no abrasions, no injuries of any kind. So tell me, officer, how exactly does someone resist without resisting? Judge Reynolds glanced toward the officer, his frown deepening. Grayson shifted in his seat. That report was written based on my experience, he muttered. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Oh, I see. So it wasn't based on facts, just your experience. A few members of the jury whispered among themselves. Elijah didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. The foundation of the prosecution's case was crumbling fast. Judge Reynolds ran a hand over his face, clearly frustrated. He should have been enjoying this, watching a cocky young upstart get humbled. But instead, he was the one being humbled. And worst of all, it was his own fault. He had underestimated Elijah. They all had. Elijah turned back to Whitmore, his face unreadable. You said earlier that you wanted to humor me, he said. That you wanted to let me embarrass myself. Whitmore swallowed hard. Well, Elijah continued, I hope you're entertained. The words landed like a punch. The tension in the room was electric. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough, he said quickly, as if trying to regain control. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because for the first time since this trial began, he wasn't the one who needed to prove himself. A thick silence blanketed the courtroom. Judge Reynolds sat rigidly behind the bench, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might snap. Whitmore, the once confident prosecutor, had sunk into his chair, his face pale and unreadable. The entire courtroom had shifted. What had started as a spectacle, a joke at Elijah's expense, had become something entirely different. This was no longer a trial. This was an exposé. Elijah stood in the center of it all, calm, composed, and in complete control. His hoodie and sneakers no longer looked out of place. They looked like armor. He took a slow step forward, his voice steady but sharp. Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on a lie, a fabricated police report, a withheld piece of exonerating evidence, and a bias so deeply ingrained that no one in this room even questioned it until now. Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose. You're making dangerous accusations, Mr. Carter. Elijah tilted his head slightly. Am I? He gestured toward the video footage that was still frozen on the screen, the undeniable proof of his innocence. Or am I simply stating facts? The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some members avoided eye contact. Others watched with rapt attention, hanging on to Elijah's every word. Whitmore finally found his voice, though it was strained. You're trying to turn this into something bigger than it is, he said. But there was no conviction behind his words. This is just one case. Elijah's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Is it? He let the question hang in the air. Or is this just one example of something that happens every single day? Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel against the bench, his voice snapping like a whip. Enough, Mr. Carter. His hands were shaking. Whether from anger or something else, even he wasn't sure. Elijah didn't flinch. He met the judge's glare with steady confidence. You wanted me to embarrass myself, he said, voice quiet but lethal. You thought this was going to be a lesson for me. A slow beat of silence. Then Elijah stepped back, his eyes scanning the room. The judge, the jury, the spectators who had laughed at him hours ago. But I think we all know who actually learned something today. A hush fell over the room. Judge Reynolds's fingers tightened around his gavel, but he didn't raise it. He didn't speak. Because what could he say? What excuse could he give? Elijah had just outplayed them all. The weight of Elijah's words settled over the courtroom, like a dense fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and for the first time since this trial began, Judge Reynolds was the one being judged. Whitmore sat stiffly, his hands clenched on the desk, his jaw tight. The once confident prosecutor, who had mocked Elijah, now looked like he wanted to disappear. He had nothing left to say, because there was nothing he could say. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Mr. Carter." He hesitated, the words struggling to form. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled. "The charges against you are dismissed." The room remained silent. There was no dramatic applause, no cheers of celebration, only the quiet, heavy realization that a 19-year-old in a hoodie had just exposed an entire system. Elijah nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. Instead, he calmly gathered his papers, tucking them neatly back into his worn backpack. As he turned to leave, the same bailiff who had doubted him earlier took a step forward, eyes filled with something that looked almost like respect. "Mr. Carter," the bailiff said cautiously. Elijah stopped but didn't turn around. The man hesitated, then spoke softer. "Good luck." A small smile flickered across Elijah's face, but he didn't respond. He simply slung his bag over his shoulder and walked out of the courtroom, not as a defendant, not as a kid being mocked, but as a lawyer who had just won his first case. Elijah stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp afternoon air. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air behind him, but he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had made his point. A few reporters hovered near the steps, murmuring among themselves, unsure whether to chase after him. They had expected a spectacle, but they had witnessed a reckoning. One finally gathered the courage to step forward. "Mr. Carter," she called, microphone in hand. "Do you have anything to say after today's events?" Elijah paused for a brief moment, his fingers tightening around the strap of his backpack. Then, with a calm certainty that had silenced an entire courtroom, he turned to face her. "Yeah," he said simply. "Never let someone else tell you what you're worth." With that, he walked away, disappearing into the city, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who would never see the world the same way again. Now, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in Elijah's shoes? Have you ever been underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you want more powerful stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes, the ones they overlook are the ones who change everything.